Perfect. Well, let's begin, shall we?
Yeah, let's go.
Let's.
Unimix.
If I don't start recording, it won't,
Oh my gosh,
it won't
Ryan.
record.
Glad you noticed that now.
Thanks God. Oh my God, Ryan.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue sur Unimix.
Vous êtes sur Unimix.
Sur Unimix, la radio des Unimix de Fribourg.
Unimix. Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to the Unimix studio for another Parenthèse Académique. Today I have the pleasure to have in our studio Agatha. Hi, Agatha.
Ryan.
Thank you for coming here and assisting me for this interview with Mr. Niklas Fischer. Hi, Mr. Fischer. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And today we will be talking about literature. So you're teaching literature, English literature in University of Fribourg. Since when have you been teaching it here?
The first course I taught was in the autumn semester of 2019. Then there was, the big break. At which, however, I should also say, in which time I wasn't in Fribourg. So I'm not a regular member of the department in the sense of that I don't have a 5-year contract or something like that with the department. I basically come in and do teaching when there's a need, which, over the past 3 semesters has been the case.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, when I first taught in 2019, then after that, I was actually on a postdoc grant, and I was away from Fribourg. And then when I came back to Switzerland, I also started teaching in Fribourg again. So
okay, so you weren't in Switzerland during your postdoc. Where were you doing it?
So technically in Berlin. Now, it was meant to start in the beginning of 2020.
Oh.
I had gone up to Berlin, at the end of January, and I came back in the middle of March. And also after that, all of academia, like the rest of the world, went online. So the location was to some extent negligible. So yeah, but nominally it was there, and that ended in the spring of 2021, and ever since then I've been back in Switzerland.
Mm-hmm. And has your goal? Did you always wanted to teach at university level, or would you rather do just research about literature?
Yeah, that's a very good question to ask literary academics, right? Now, obviously, I can't speak for everyone, but I feel very confident in generalizing that most academics would prefer to do primarily research.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of academics enjoy teaching, and I also have to say personally that to me, if I've had to do a hierarchy of likes, I think research is hard to top, because if you have the time and the money to do it, if you're in a funded position or you're doing a PhD, it's a very special and lovely experience to kind of have, this opportunity to really dig into something.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard to beat. That's also a big privilege. Not a lot of people in the world get to do that. So I think that is hard to beat. Having said that, I think teaching is potentially a lot more rewarding, because you interact with people, and you also see all this knowledge that you think is important. When you see other people all of a sudden, acquiring that knowledge and also being able to do things with that is just, it's very fulfilling. So I have to say, I do, every time I've taught, I've enjoyed it a lot, and I hope I get to keep doing it.
That's lovely. That's brilliant.
Mm-hmm. And so, you've been studying literature,
Yes.
but how would you explain doing research in literature? Because when you do research in medicine or physics, it's something really concrete. But with literature, I mean, some relatives might just say, "Oh, but you're just reading books. That's not a real job."
I mean, I think you've raised at least two issues that are quite different. So I'll address them one by one. The first one is research in literature has a lot to do with reading books. So it's not wrong to say that. However, research in a lot of other fields has a lot to do with reading books. You know, it's not as if people that work in empirical sciences are just constantly doing experiments and not writing and reading stuff, right? However, when you do literary studies, obviously a lot of it is just reading. Having said that, literary studies is not one thing. And, you know, there are, for example, people that work in a field like book history. They actually are out about in the world and handling objects, you know, and a lot of their work is, they still read a lot, but they also, you know, they actually have, I mean, that's empirical work, you know, they look at books, they catalog things, you know, and it's very similar with, you know, this question of like, are you just sort of reading and is it very, very abstract? It depends on what you're working on, right? There are more philosophical directions in literature, which, or, you know, philosophical or theoretical directions, which deal with big questions, you know, about, I mean, you can even start with something big like, you know, what is literature? You know, how do we define that? Mm-hmm. Now, to answer that, you mostly just think. You read, you write, you think, and you can say, okay, that's the abstract stuff. But then, you know, if you say people that work on the representation of women or of black people in the early modern period, you know, in Shakespeare and his contemporaries, that's again fairly unabstract because you're going to look at historical records. You're going to see, okay, you know, so on a first glance, these people are kind of invisible, right? Women are not allowed on stage in Shakespeare's time. I'm not an expert on this period, but I don't think in England, for example, that there were a lot of black people on the stage. We obviously famously have Othello always in blackface, right? Mm. I'm not even sure if back then they did blackface, but the famous Laurence Olivier, which obviously is much later, right? He did it in blackface. But the point being that first, you know, you look into concrete historical records and circumstances, which is very different from having an abstract question like what is literature? Or, you know, there are many other abstract questions you can ask about literature. And so, you know, that's part of the answer is it's not one thing. And it's not just abstract. I mean, that's, I think that's a false, you know, opposition to create. Part of it is abstract for sure, but most disciplines have an abstract component. And so I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Now I know that's not going to satisfy anyone at the Christmas table, right? That's the kind of answer that I feel comfortable giving among people that also study and are willing to engage with these questions. Now, when someone who doesn't really care that much for literature and, you know, has a more pragmatic outlook on life asks you, so you read books, you know, but why? What's the point of that? I think if you try to answer that with what might be the point of studying literature, you're already going wrong. Because that's not what the question is, right? The real question that usually stands behind this is, how is this going to secure your existence in the future? Yeah. So the idea of the legitimacy of literary studies in that question has nothing actually to do with, you know, does this discipline produce useful knowledge? Does it contribute to, you know, a form of social cohesion or things like that? It does not. That's not the question. So if you try to answer it that way, which is kind of how that's the direction in which I went before, that's not where you should go. So if you look at it as a money question, if we just break it down very simply, I usually think I mean, I should ask. So you're both English students, right?
Yep, that's right.
So Agatha, you told me you're looking to go into publishing afterwards.
That's right.
Ryan, what about you?
I'd like to be a teacher for just before university level.
Like the college level.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think publishing is actually something that I've heard before, but not often. Going to become a college teacher, very, very common. I think most of my students in Fribourg are on track to become college teachers. And that's your answer, right? If you become a teacher at college level in Switzerland, you have a very good income. You have a very secure position once you get one. And the whole question of what does this do is, well, you're a high school teacher. Like, you have a very direct, socially traceable effect.
Mm-hmm.
So
everyone can picture himself what a high school teacher would do. Yeah.
Exactly. And also, I don't think there's much, obviously there may be some cynical people that say, oh, what does, our education system doesn't do much. And sure, people that look at it that way, they might be skeptical, but everyone else, this is it's like saying, I'll be a lawyer, I'll be a doctor. It's like you have a certain income, you have a secure income, and you have a role to fulfill in society. And so I think if you're on that track, that would be my answer. Because the more philosophical and interesting answer is not going to interest people that say, so, what is it that you're doing? So I think that's the direction I would take it. Now, publishing, I would say you can take a similar track, probably a little less certain than becoming a teacher,
Yeah,
I imagine.
Definitely.
I don't know, what's your experience been with that? Have you gotten a lot of skeptical looks? Or
Yes, publishing, I'm not so sure what the situation in Switzerland would be, but I know that in England and America, it's an extremely competitive market, and the salary is, it's not amazing. It's not a top job. We're not talking a lawyer salary. It's pretty basic. You have to really climb up in the business to be able to get to a certain place, and that really can sometimes scare families. So all the other people who don't want to become teachers, I actually know quite a few, they often they're sitting there and their parents are like, okay, so how are you going to fund yourself? How are you going to fund your PhD? I mean, most families are having panic attacks because their kids are going to be in studies for the next 7 years, and they're like, oh my gosh. But yeah, no, it's not easy, but I think you've just got to really kind of stick with your dream, and even if you've got to maybe tell your grandparents a little white lie and say, okay, yeah, by this time I will be earning this much money, don't worry, then, to put them at rest, calm them down a bit and get the fire off you at Christmas dinner, and they can attack the next sibling, So yeah.
Yeah, I think, the question about money, which, don't get me wrong, I would never belittle that question, right? You need to think about that, obviously. At the same time, I think, we are getting to a point in the way we look at success and the way we look at what life is about that is clearly no longer just dependent on money. And, if you've either grown up in Switzerland or lived in Switzerland for a long time, chances are you've seen a lot of people with pretty good jobs. Maybe not millionaires as such, but people that, are not really worried about their income, that, can plan having a family without too much stress, that, can think about getting a mortgage and a house and, so that are in a position where you're not talking about existence, right? You're talking about shaping your life according to your ideas and desires. And you've seen people like that, and you also realize that a lot of them aren't very happy. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, that is, you need money to survive. But you also see that alone is not going to solve all your problems, right? And I don't think anyone ever thought that, It's not as if people are that naive. They're really not. But you definitely see it enough to wonder, okay, so what else, right? It can't just be the money. And I think when you have that mindset, you also can receive that question, a bit more chill, right? Because you know what you've thought about, right? And when you think about going into publishing, like you've thought about this, right? And there's a part of you that sees something fulfilling in that job and in that activity. And other people that, again, mostly focus on the money, they're not going to see that. So you can't explain it to them anyway. And so I think, I'm absolutely with you. You say whatever you need to say to calm or smooth the waters. And then, you focus on what's important to you and you do that, right?
So you've been studying literature, but I mean, there's plenty of English literature, American literature, English literature. And if I remember correctly, you did some of your studies in Australia, right?
Yeah, I did my PhD in Sydney.
Oh, okay. So what is your favorite kind of literature? Has your experience in Australia changed the way how you see what we've been studying when it's really like USA and English focused?
I mean, I'm still very much a Britain-focused researcher.
That's great.
Oh, come on!
I mean, I have to say, not because there was, this conscious choice to focus on Britain. It just in the course of the research it happened. Now, obviously, it's important to say that it's changing now, but for a long time, right, we obviously have most scholarly material on British and American authors because that's where the subjects became most dominant in university. And also, in other countries like India, where, English studies happened very, very early, that was obviously also very England-focused, or Britain-focused. And so when I say it kind of, I kind of stumbled into it, I also could stumble into it, right? I couldn't have necessarily stumbled as easily in Nigerian English literature because there's just a lot less material around to have you stumble into it. You kind of need to find it and then go there, right? Rather than tap around and all of a sudden you're in this sea of knowledge about certain authors. So I ended up there, I have nothing against America, but I don't know, for some reason, I guess American literature never did it that much to me than did a lot of British literature. Mm-hmm. You make a good point. Like there is when we say English literature, I think today we should really speak of English language literature. And because there are a lot of countries in the world where people speak English as their first language, or as a second language, which is basically also like a second mother tongue, mm-hmm. that are not British, that are not in the Commonwealth, that are not American. And so, that we need to take into account. Like English literature today is an absolutely massive field, or English language literature is, beyond anything that anyone could ever attempt to master as a whole. So, but it's exciting because there is a lot, and there constantly is more, right? Because more and more writers start writing in English, even when it's just a second language. Mm-hmm. And this is also getting more attention in publishing, right? We get, try to think of his name. I think it's Steve Kellman. He coined this notion of the translingual, which is when you write in a language that isn't your first language. And I think for a while this was only ever tolerated in, greats. Someone like Samuel Beckett, who at one point I think he said, I'm probably messing up the quote, but his line was something like, I write in French because I want to write without style. The sense of without being impacted by his knowledge of, all of English that he's read in literature and that has been done before. And I think that was kind of confined to a few authors, and now this is breaking up, and people are getting published. A couple of years ago, the Booker Prize was always one of the most or it's one of the biggest literary prizes in the world. It gets a lot of publicity, but now they're really pushing the international booker, right? I mean, at first I think there was the move to open it up to people that were not, I mean, you should check this, but I think for a while it was actually only an American and British prize. And then it was opened up to, I think, English language fiction, but then there's also the International Booker Prize, which, as far as I know, looks not just at English fiction. I think it has to be translated into English, but it doesn't have to be written in English first. And so I think there are movements like that happening, which constantly broaden our understanding what English language literature might be.
Okay, well, that's actually really interesting. It could be another good thing to say at Christmas dinner, that it's a constantly expanding field. I mean, a lot of my family kind of assume that I'm studying basically historical English literature, but it's lovely. I mean, also with experience on our first year at university, it is true that we're being put in front of this immense quantity of literature, and it's wonderful. I mean, we get a point of view from everywhere, and it's great to see everyone included as well. Like from back when our parents were at university, I mean, inclusion-wise, you wouldn't necessarily be studying as many female authors or necessarily like ethnic authors. So it's really nice to have that integrity that started to appear at the level of English literature. If I can ask, how did you get into literature? Like, what was the childhood trauma, I want to say, that got you into literature?
I mean, I don't have, a good founding myth for myself. Like, I don't have a good origin story for myself as a reader. I think it's a very, very typical case in just, like to read a lot and tended to be a bit more introverted, like spending time by myself. And I have, very similar touch points or, very similar coordinates. So we talked a bit before the interview about Harry Potter, right? And Harry Potter for me was definitely something that fostered that love of reading a lot. And I had I actually have a little origin story about how I got into English, because when I learned about Harry Potter, the first 3 volumes were out, and they had been translated into German. And I mean, I was a kid, right? I didn't know English at the time. So, I read them, and like most kids, I was through these 3 books in no time. And then the big wait began, right, for The Goblet of Fire. And I grew up in a little village in the Berner Oberland, and there was one bookshop, still there. I'd go in and said, so, when is this book coming out? And they said something like, in half a year or something, that's when it's announced. And so it's like, okay, I'd like to pre-order one. It's like, sure. Part of me just, didn't want to wait. And so I think I just kept going back there almost every day asking if it had arrived. Half a year before it was announced.
That's brilliant.
And understandably, the people working at the bookshop got annoyed.
Oh, it's him again.
Exactly, right? Like no. Like yesterday was 6 months. It's still 6 months today, and tomorrow it's still 6 months, right? Like, so just leave us alone. So I'd still go, but once I'd realized that they were very annoyed with me, I would just kind of linger, because it's this classical. At the time, this was this thing of you'd always get off school at that point by like 2:30, that type of thing, right? Often also, like, my parents weren't at home yet, so there was like this thing of like I just needed to kill some time, and bookshops are as good as any place to do that. And there was a tiny section of English books or English language books, and I looked at that and I saw there was a Harry Potter in there, and but I didn't recognize the cover at all, and the scene on the cover neither, right? Because I knew obviously. Books have different covers. They don't have to have identical covers, but it's like I don't recognize that scene. And I've been through these books like 3 times, so I know them inside out. So I take it up to the counter and say, like, what's this one? And, you know, the woman working there looked at me and said, oh, that's the new one. And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, well, it's in English. Like, oh, it's out in English. It just hasn't been translated yet. And so I bought it, you know, and she says, like, do you know English? And I was like, I don't care. Like, I need it. I need it. And
That's great.
so I took it home and you know, I mean, you know, read it in quotation marks because I didn't really know English. You know, I just started English at school at the time, so I think that was about 7th grade, something like that. And yeah, there was no way I could actually read it, and I had the dictionary open, you know, and somehow I sort of crawled myself through it, and then immediately read it again, you know, just to sort of do that, and then. You know, finally the German one came out. I read that, and then it went back to the English, right? And I think that was the point for me where I became, where it was clear for me of like, okay, I need to read these in the original. And I think, you know, a lot of my English education happened with that 4th volume of Harry Potter, because I have to say I really hated English at school at the time.
Oh, wow.
Really didn't like it at all. It was not a language that I thought was beautiful or, you know, this was also the time, right, of the, you know, the Bush-Gore election, and obviously the height of a lot of the you know, anti-terror rhetoric. And I think, you know, at the time, we, sort of the more left-leaning kids at school, we were very anti-American. And I think English for us, you know, was like this American thing. And we just kind of, there was this clear vibe of like, this doesn't interest me. It's not beautiful, you know, like I don't want to go to America, you know, there was all these things. And Harry Potter kind of changed that. And and then after that, I can't really tell, like it's you know how it goes, like you keep reading and, you know, one book sort of leads to the next, and then, you know, 20 years later, you sit at Unimix and talk about why you teach literature type of deal.
Yeah.
So, so what's your favorite book now?
Oh, I mean, I don't have a favorite book of all time, right? I really don't, and I resist the idea to. I usually have like 1 or 2 books that I've recently read that I think, you know, are really good. And for me right now, very clearly, I have to say, is on the one hand, there's Checkout 19 by Claire Louise Bennett. She's a contemporary Irish writer, which is actually about reading and writing. It's a novel, but that's what the book is about. Which is, she is it's just a mind-blowing experience to read her prose. She's also got a collection of short stories out that was published a couple of years ago called Pond, which is also very good. But Checkout 19 is, you know, I definitely recommend. Then there's also Patricia Lockwood's Nobody is Talking About This, or No One is Talking About This, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize a couple of years ago, or was it last year? I'm always bad on the year since Corona. Which is pretty much about, you know, our lives online. But she's originally, like, she's written a lot of poetry, and this is her first novel, and it's just language-wise and image-wise, it's incredibly engrossing and enthralling. So these two, I think, are the last 2 books that really flashed me, you know. But other than that, you know, I kind of have the problem, which if you're studying literature, you might have too, which is when you study literature, you get the opportunity to like a book the 2nd or the 3rd time around.
Yes.
And, you know, so I, for example, I am, you know, a huge fan of Virginia Woolf. There is almost no book I would hands down recommend to someone and say, like, oh, you know, read this and you'll get it. Because my way, don't get me wrong, lots of people are capable of doing that. But my way to Woolf was I kept encountering her in my studies, and I found her very difficult, like annoyingly difficult, you know, to a point where I thought she was trying to keep me out. And I couldn't see it. And then as I kept sort of reading Woolf because I had to, and then slowly started seeing things, and then I got interested in her and learned more about her and her life. And, this is a huge thing because she was at the heart of the Bloomsbury Group, which is, a group in the beginning of the 20th century, which basically became which we look at today as one of the most artistically productive, groups, or they weren't a collective, they never sort of had statutes or something. Because they lived in Bloomsbury, that's why we call them that. It's not as if they named themselves that. And as I got sort of drawn into that, all of a sudden it opened out. And now, I'm a huge, huge fan. But I just recently had this question from a friend who works in Zurich, and he said, at university, there's like, so which one would you recommend first? And it was very hard. I don't know. It's very difficult with these kinds of writers to say, yeah, here's that book and you'll love it, which, is very different from something like Harry Potter, obviously, but or even fiction that just is a little less challenging to read. Because, also that recommendation, if we're in the family context, that's always going to exasperate people when you say stuff like, oh, this book is really good, but actually it's very hard to read, right? They sort of feel like, well, then I'm not going to read it, which is their good right.
And yeah, exactly. So you really have to, in a sense, work for it. But, so coming back to literary studies, when you have to work with a book and to do text analysis, there's always plenty of way to see a text. We have a big prism. Obviously, we can't make the text say anything. It's bound to certain things, but how would you justify that a way of viewing the text is not the true one, but is a good way to see the text? I mean, it's
because it's so personal. I think when you're reading, it's such a personal experience. The message that you get out of a book or of a text isn't necessarily the same as the one that your professor might get from reading the text.
How would you say that it's like a legitimate, like a science? I mean, if you study it, if you do research about it, like
there is a certain scientific background to it. I mean, it can't only be our personal feelings going into these papers.
Yeah.
English literature studies are still. I don't want to say that they're a science, but there is still some facts, some guidelines to follow. So yeah, how would you? What are these guidelines? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, there isn't one guideline to follow. Generally, though, I don't really think this is that much of a problem. Like, the people that say, oh, you can interpret a text whatever way you want. Clearly, I've never interpreted a text. And so I don't think, that is the case at all. It's the same rules for what you think is convincing in any argument. If someone out there makes any claim, right, about anything, you're most likely not going to believe it right away. I mean, unless it's super obvious, right? You can, if someone says humans breathe, you're like, yep, that. Like someone would have to prove to me that that's not the case, right? I believe that. But with other things, it's about how you present evidence for your interpretation, right? And this evidence, don't get me wrong, there is still a matter of someone can say, I find this convincing or not, but you can make sure that it is a lot more convincing than it is not. And I think, we encounter this in non-literary contexts all the time. I mean, when in America, when the right to abortion was struck out of the Constitution, or struck out of the interpretation of the Constitution, because it's not as if it had been written in there in that way. This was all about these judges. When you look at the opinions that they gave, right in the American system, whenever there is a Supreme Court decision, each judge needs to write a so-called opinion or a response to the opinion. And that's all textual interpretation, because, it's not something that is in the Constitution. There is a sentence that says, every female citizen of the United States has the right to abortion. It's just textual interpretation of where that right might have been articulated implicitly, and then how it was interpreted by other people, like other judges before that wrote about, we think there is the right or not. And then in the end, you end up saying this is not a question of was it in the Constitution or not, but is your interpretation valid? And I think with this particular case, what you get, where you can absolutely question the validity of the decision to remove the right, or to no longer say that the Constitution protects this right, is that when you look at these interpretations, there are interpretations that are against it and that say, the state just shouldn't say either way, right? You do get a lot of ideological content that comes with it. A lot of it is religious. A lot of it has to do with this idea of, is the federal government allowed to interfere with the right of a state? And once you look at that, those are very clearly different issues. And if someone in the end says, look, I'm against abortion because, I believe in the sanctity of any form of life, you're having a very, very different conversation than saying, well, there's a legal history for how we got here. And so I think literary interpretation sort of tries to unearth, what are the ideological attitudes that are there, so that you can then judge based on these. And once you get to that level, you can make very good arguments that can be very convincing or very unconvincing. And it's also then no longer that personal. The personal will always be the entry point. That's why it's art. Art, it's very important, what we feel, how it speaks to us, that's very important as a first step, which is not that important if you read, a medical text, or something like that. But then when you move into interpretation, you move actually into a very rational territory, right? And you can no longer say, well, or if you say, I think this text means X because I feel it's true, most people will say, well, sure, but then someone else could just say, I feel the opposite is true, and you would never get to a point, right? So I think it's very similar to how we judge something that's convincing in a normal perspective, and also literary studies, because it is aiming at sort of looking at what is behind the text. What are these attitudes at work here? What kind of world does it try to represent? When you do that, you actually get a much clearer view of what a text is doing. It's too far to say this is objective in the way something is objective, maybe in the hard sciences, but it's not just completely subjective at all. You work with very palpable, concrete concepts.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's another thing for Christmas dinner. When your grandmother looks at you and says you're just talking about fairies and dreaming things up on a Shakespeare piece, well, you go, no, it's rational. There's kind of a science to it. No, that's great.
Exactly, yeah. And so when you do that kind of research, is there a way to fail in a certain sense? Like when you start with a text, you have a hypothesis, and then you test it with you see if the text corresponds to your hypothesis. But if it turns out that you were wrong at the beginning, how do you handle that?
Well, being wrong can be very, very productive. And as a rule, being wrong is how you get to be right. Right? Few people are capable of starting with being right or just formulating clear hypotheses. Or, you only have to formulate a hypothesis when you don't know what the answer is. Right? When you know the answer, you don't need it. You have the answer. And this is something, people also forget about the sciences. It's the very same process. We only get accurate scientific knowledge because lots of people have been wrong in the sciences before, right? And this is not at all a knock on the sciences. To the contrary, this is what makes the sciences such a reliable subject, is that you always have to work on the assumption that, the knowledge that you produce is reliable, but you also know that things can happen that actually disprove them, and yeah, you know, once people stopped believing that the Earth was at the center of the universe, all of a sudden astronomy radically changed, right? But before then, you know, they were also working with scientific methods. It's not as if they didn't have them. And so I think it's a very similar process for literary studies. Is, you know, you're constantly trying to get closer to the truth, and when you realize you either missed it or you're not there yet, you just keep going. And I think that's generally what literary studies has to offer in terms of a more general mode of thinking. And, you know, this is actually, I think, you know, the thing I said before about that literary studies isn't just a subjective thing, you know, that's, again, a difficult answer to give at the Christmas dinner table. But I think what I would say about the type of thinking it teaches you how to do is, because literature is such a vast repository of knowledge and perspectives, the one thing that you will never get when you study this is arrogant about your own viewpoint, because you are completely aware of all, well, not of all, but of how many different ways there are to look at a problem or to look at the world. And this will make you very, very cautious about saying you figured it out, right? And this doesn't mean that, you know, you get to a point where you can never say, ooh, like, you know, I don't know, I can't say, you know, because there's so many viewpoints. It's not that. It's just that the more you know, the Socratic principle, right? I know that I don't know. Like, the more that you know, the more you become aware of all the things that you don't know. And I think that in itself is a very, very useful way to think. And so also failure figures into that, right? You're always kind of failing in the sense of you never grasp the totality of something, but only ever parts. And I think that is something, you know, the world desperately needs, because, you know, whenever people have very, very strong opinions on the world, I guarantee you they do not engage with the other side. Like, it's impossible. Like, they might look at it and then say that's all, you know, that's all nonsense, but I don't think they try to understand, because it's really a curse, you know. It's when you do take other viewpoints seriously, you realize how difficult it is to have an absolute position, you know, except for very obvious things. Like, you know, if I don't know, if people are just racist or sexist, and you realize they believe, like, you know, non-white people are worth less than white people, or women are worth less than men, you know, it's very easy to have an absolute opinion on that. That's you know, and you should. But most other issues that I guess we deal with are not like that. You know, they're not just this black and white thing. And yeah, the horrible truth is, the more you look at the other side of the argument, the more you probably will be convinced at least a little bit. You know, you won't have this absolute position anymore. And I think that is something where, I mean, you would have to be, you know, a completely cold person to read a lot of literature and not become aware of this diversity and this multiplicity of viewpoints.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that's really interesting, actually. Very, very true. I was wondering, so you're here, you're at university in Fribourg. Like, what is the next step? Like, what are you researching right now? What are your future plans in literature?
Well, I'm currently working on a book on E.M. Forster, who's a British novelist from the beginning of the 20th century, or that's at least when he wrote most of his novels. He also belongs sort of with that Bloomsbury group. He was kind of at the margins of it, but that time and also that place for a while. And that's that's, you know, the immediate project. Like, this I want to get done fairly soon. You know, it's been on my mind for a long time, and it also just needs to get done. You know, I realize, like, I don't have that much more energy in me to deal with it, so I just need to finish it, which is very often, like, you know, the stage of a project when you get things done, right? Which is when you're close to being fed up, then you're like, okay, now I need to.
Exactly.
That's that. More generally, it's hard to say, you know, and this has to do with actually the job prospects of being a literary scholar, because, and maybe we return to that, you know. So I said, if you want to go into publishing and if you want to become a teacher, you actually have a very good answer for the question, you know. So what do you do and why? Now, obviously, when you go into publishing, or you go into teaching, you're no longer going to be doing literary studies in your job, right? That's no longer what your primary goal is, or your primary activity. If you become an academic, and it is your primary activity, you also enter by now a very difficult job market, which has certain drawbacks. I mean, one is you definitely have to be willing to travel, because you just kind of have to go where the work is, which, is true of most jobs. But for example, in Switzerland, there aren't a lot of English departments and there aren't a lot of positions. And so it's, unless you manage to get one of these, it means you probably have to leave the country if you want to work in the field. The other thing is that, everywhere in the world, English departments get smaller. They receive less funding.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. It's, in England, this is massively going on at the moment. English departments tend to be cut down drastically. And, funding for PhDs and these things. And what also is happening, even where you have jobs, you kind of, the unlimited positions, or these long-term positions, they're disappearing too, which doesn't mean that you can't get work, but again, if you're someone who says, I want to do long-term planning, family planning, all these things, it makes it difficult if you only get 1 or 2 year contracts, with no promise of anything being beyond it. And so, I'm in this situation at the moment where it's very uncertain, and so it's connected to also larger life decisions about, do I want to leave Switzerland? How far would I go? And I'm very honest with you, I haven't fully figured this out yet. I definitely want to continue teaching if it's possible, because as I said, that is a very a rewarding activity. But beyond that, it's very open for me, and I think it is for a lot of people in my position. There is no one clear way that you go. Or that you can go at this stage, I think. If for the people that there is, it's a combination of they've worked really hard and they were also at the right place at the right time, And so I think, it's very open.
Yeah, well, that's actually really reassuring to hear, because a lot of people have not necessarily decided or don't have a fixed plan, or they're 25 coming out of uni, they've done English studies and they're not necessarily sure about what they want to do. So I think you've also got to look at it in a positive way, that you've got this whole, what's going to happen next, it's really open for you. Kind of like the world's your oyster. I mean, you've just got to go for it. I think you've got to go around, look for what you want to do, and then sometimes something pops up at the right moment. But I think it's really nice to hear that, not everyone is coming out with a fixed plan, with a fixed job. It's just, you're there and it's open. It's scary, but it's also fun.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of these subjects, right, where most people, again, unless you go into teaching, that's the only sort of more secure way, right? But the others are open, and there's not this clear option to choose, right? Or that offers itself. And I think the important thing there is to be honest with yourself. Because, if you crave a certain stability, I would not recommend becoming a literary scholar. It's definitely, I mean, you can still get stability, but it's a very difficult way, or it's very difficult to get it. So I wouldn't recommend that. If you're looking for that. More generally speaking, I also think with people that study literature, I think it's very important to keep asking yourself, why you're doing it. Because, the love of books will carry you only so far. And also, you can always read books and love books, right? You don't need to actually study literature to love books and read books. And I think to me, it's completely fine also to say, look, I do love it, but this more academic approach actually takes some of the excitement of it out, for me, or kind of tampers a bit with, that energy and that love that I used to feel when doing it. Then it's also fine to say, well, maybe, I'm just a reader, you know, and not necessarily an academic reader, which can be two very different things. And I think there's no, you know, I don't think there is a hierarchy there. You know, I think very often of Virginia Woolf, you know, coined this concept, or not coined it, but she made it famous, the idea of the common reader. And, you know, Virginia Woolf, right, she never went to school, not a single day in her life, because she was a woman and, you know, they didn't go to school at the time. And her education famously was that her father just said, here's the library. You can, whatever book you want, right, you can read it. And she was a voracious reader and, you know, is an incredibly intelligent, or was a very incredibly intelligent woman. And that's an education in reading. And right, and she's one of the most perceptive readers there is because she read a lot. And I think readers that do that, you know, are incredibly valuable readers to have. And I think, you know, even from a publisher's perspective, right, I think academics are not your favorite audience because, first of all, they don't tend to have a lot of time to read. And second of all, they always have an interest, right? They want to publish a thing on it. They want to have an opinion on it. They want to engage in the debate with it. But they're not necessarily the people that, you know, at the end of the day, sort of kick off their shoes, you know, make themselves a cup of tea and then read, you know, and really just see if they're enjoyed or not. And so I think, you know, to me is like readers that don't necessarily do it analytically are very important and are actually, to be very honest, right, they're what keeps literature afloat. Literature departments also contribute a fair share to it. It's not that they don't do anything, but, you know, literature has always meant to be a social phenomenon, right? This idea of that you just, you know, you hide in your room with your book is, to me, an absurd one. And it is an absurd one from experience because I used to be like that. You know, for me, it was, I love books because I could retreat from life, you know, and could escape into a world that was different, right? And it was always a very secluded activity. You know, I couldn't wait to get away from people so I could read again, you know, was that type of thing. And it was only much later, you know, I did it like that at uni too when I started. You know, I was very like withdrawn and from the studies and or like from the collective of students, you know, and would just read. And to me, it's like, look, this thing, literature only matters if you read and you talk to other people about it who also read, right? And that aspect is really, really important. And I think when that goes away and you just have, you know, individual people reading books, it's no longer really literature. You know, that's not really different from people just sitting on their phones and not talking to someone, right? And so I think, you know, it clicked for me that that's the real bad escapism. Right, you know, we sometimes talk bad about talk badly about escapism because we say, like, look, there are problems in the world, and you just, you know, put up Netflix and ignore it and have some ice cream, you know, and it allows you to ignore the world. And first of all, I think, you know, I mean, a little bit of escapism probably keeps people from killing themselves.
Yeah, it keeps us sane, definitely.
Right. So I think, you know, we shouldn't be too down on, like, if you obviously, you know, feel like I refuse to read the news, you know, I refuse to ever think about problems in the world, then that's bad. But if you're just, if you say, like, I need a little break today, I think that's fine. But I think the bad form of escapism is really when you escape into this idea that it's just you and the book. You know, and you can just, you know, you can read it and you can love it and that's enough. And I think it really isn't. It's only when you start sharing this with people, because the exchange, again, you know, you get to see different perspectives. You get to, you know the book better. And then also you see literature doing that social work, right? It is only because it does that work that it is worth doing. Because I think this idea of, you know, someone creating a masterpiece that like a couple of people read or no one for 100 years, it's intriguing to think about, you know, and it's always exciting when something happens where they say like, oh, you know, the lost book was found or something like that, right? Like the great work by an author that everyone thought was lost was found. I mean, that's exciting, but it does not, you know, that's so divorced from life and that's so isolated that I think that should never be forgotten. And that you can do at university, you can do it at college, you can do it in your own home, you don't need to be, you don't need to have a PhD for that at all, right? You also don't need an MA or a BA for that at all. It probably helps if you do, because you learn how to read, I don't want to say better, but you learn how to read more sensitively. Like, your eyes are probably awake to a lot more things in a text than if you haven't had this education. But that to me is, particularly when you're at the bachelor and master level, that's the most important part to keep in mind. And, if you don't continue doing, you're definitely not betraying literature. Right.
That's actually great. I love it. It's a wonderful skill that we get when we're doing our bachelor's degree, really getting this more global and interesting view of reading. And one of the things that I love at the moment is that anyone, as you said, as Virginia Woolf would have called them, us common readers or academic readers, whoever, there's platforms now like Goodreads, or even like Instagram or TikTok now has this book talk side of it. It's amazing, and you've got all of these people who are exchanging, and maybe not at an academic level, but it's still a massive exchange about books, and so many people are now participating in that. It's become so mainstream now. Reading is actually cool now. We went from reading being so rejected when we were young, bookworm was like a bad term, but now it's just become, it's become so cool to be a nerd. So yeah.
Yeah, I think we have the hard sciences to thank for that, right? Like because as usual, right, for something to become cool in culture, you need to make money, and all of a sudden, when all these nerds, right, ended up in these startups, in Silicon Valley, it was cool to be. And I think with reading, it's a very similar thing. I do often joke though that when you're like a dating platform, right? It's like people that say like, I like to read, like that sentence you find so often in a bio, right? Particularly once, the app has learned to filter for your bubble. And I always wonder, so what does that mean? Because, when some people say I like reading, it's like, look, this is the thing I do when I have time. Like when I can choose what to do, I do it. And with other people, it's more like, I don't mind a book, right? And I'm not saying, that that's bad at all, but I think there are very different approaches to reading. And so I think that is to be kept in mind. Having said that, I think, there is a lot more exchange. And I think I definitely prefer a lot of people that might not feel very secure in their interpretation and don't really know what happens in the book, talking about it together and trying to figure it out, than someone incredibly smart just reading it on their own and then going on to the next book. I think there is something very sterile in that act. And so, yeah, it's also, interesting, or it'll be interesting to see how, platforms like TikTok, where I think that seems to be the biggest so far, right? Like I feel like BookTube and Instagram hasn't been.
It's really starting to hit Instagram now. Like I follow a lot of book club accounts on Instagram, millions of followers. But it is true that TikTok. There's a new book out called Light Lark, and the only reason that this woman managed to publish, she tried all the publishing houses, no one took her. She made a video about it on TikTok. The next morning she had over 1 million views. She's now signed a 6-figure contract. Her book has just been published. It's on my reading list. I'm going to read it soon. And I think it's amazing that we've got this platform and excited people about books who are actually united on social media about this. And it's one of the positive aspects I see at the moment, and people talking about it. It's nice. I read just the other day A Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, and I was a wreck. I cried for about 45 minutes afterwards. And it's so reassuring to have a community out there that you post something on your Instagram, you say, I just cried for 45 minutes. 5 people respond, yeah, I cried for like an hour too, and then you talk about it. What did you think? How do you feel? Have you read the next book? And it's wonderful.
That's quite impressive. And if I'm correct, I've heard that the English Forschaft would like to do something like that, to have a book club, and I think not just like pure Shakespeare academic books. Like I'm really hoping that it will be
dynamic, and I think reading is not something that should be segregated, and people shouldn't judge depending on what people read. I mean, if you're reading, it's just great, and yeah, I really hope they do a book club. It would be great.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. I make sure to talk about it to them.
Well, I think this time of the great book, the great few books is definitely past. In academia too. Everyone's very aware of the fact that the reason we got great books to begin with, or so-called great books, is because a couple of people chose them, and then everyone else kept working on them and talking about them, and then they become a thing. But that doesn't mean, and they can also be great. It's not as if they were fake great. They were great, but that doesn't mean that there's not lots of other great things out there. And I think this opening up of from sort of like a minority of books to a majority is clearly happening, and is to be applauded, obviously. I think with reading, I do, when I hear you speak, I'm like 80% enthusiastic and 20% reluctant, and the 20% simply comes from, I definitely prefer when people read no matter what it is and talk to each other about it. I think what's very important though is one should never be a completely naive reader, right? And I think there is, and particularly in our current age, I think that the biggest question always is, to what extent do I become an object in market thinking, right? And the Song of Achilles is actually very interesting because this has touched a lot of people like you. I've heard this a lot before. There are also very interesting studies about book talkers who, or rather not book talkers, but publishing houses working with book talkers and realizing that when they cry about a book on TikTok, they sell more, right? Yeah. Because there is sort of this effective thing, and I think
it's advertising. It's a free advertising platform, basically.
And so I think it's important to be aware of that aspect of reading too. I think you need to go, like, always bring your enthusiasm to it, and your excitement and your love and your willingness to be affected. I think that is incredibly important. And that's why generally I'm triumphant. I'm like, let's read and let's talk and get more people involved. But I think it is also important, to keep the other part in mind, which is like, it definitely isn't just that rosy. There are other interests there. And I mean, that's why, the 6 figures is incredibly interesting because that keeps cropping up in success stories of books. I don't know, did you... we were already following literature when the cat person affair happened in the New Yorker.
Oh, yeah, that rings a bell.
So Cat Person is a short story by Kate Rupenian. It was published in the New Yorker. And actually, I mean, this was, I think, maybe 2018 or 17, something like that. And I think when it was published in the New Yorker, it was just a short story in the New Yorker. It was, sure, good, but it's not as if people, freaked out. And then someone tweeted about it, and because the story is about a young woman, she's at college, she goes out with an older guy. I mean, he's not that, or maybe he's 10 years older, but he's like 28 or something. There's like, they're both still relatively young, but there is an age difference. And she, at one point, ends up going home with him and sleeps with him. But just before they start having sex, she, thinks, actually, I don't want to, but then thinks about how she feels like now it's too late to say no. So obviously this meshed very well with Me Too. And, it was shared, and, lots of readers, particularly women, reacted like, oh my God, this so clearly articulates an experience I've had before, which is this, this weird gray area where you say like, well, I wouldn't call this rape because I never signaled a no, but I also felt like I couldn't signal a no, right? And Kate Rupenian right away was approached by publishers. She'd only ever published some short stories and got a 6-figure deal. And this was always mentioned, the 6-figure deal. The thing is, I guess the story by now, because it's simply interesting for its content, I have to say it's otherwise not really a great short story. but it contributed something very vital, you know, and was important that it was there. But I also feel like I've never ever heard of Kate Repinion again. I don't even know if this novel's out, you know. But so she did that, and I feel like I hear stories like that again and again, where the six figures are named as like, look at this, you know, look at how much it achieved. And there again, I'm like, we should not, you know, bring money into literary quality, because every time, you know, we see, you know, best-selling author or like, you know, New York Times best-selling.
On every book, the best-selling author. I just don't get that. And it's literally on every book that you buy now. If you go to Payot, it's all the best-selling author of everything.
Well, but it's also just, you know, obviously, it's not as if things that get sold a lot are automatically trash. Definitely not. You know, a lot of really good stuff gets sold a lot, and because it's good, you know. But I think it's just, there I definitely show my resistance, where I feel like, you know, this market logic is very, very problematic, because books have the disadvantage of the amount of sales does not at all represent the amount of engagement with a book, right? It's also like lots of people, and I also include that, right? Like I have lots of books I probably will never read. So it's not as if I would say, like, you know, I read everything and I feel like I can speak from a position of authority here, but it's just that sales and what a book does in a culture are two completely different things. Or also, it can do something in a culture without people ever reading it, because you can just engage with the discussion about a book. You know, we usually have this when a book deals with what are considered controversial issues, you know, that mesh with what we're talking about at the time. And so it's, you know, I feel like I'm definitely a bit disenchanted with that direction of where we get very focused on how much can be sold, because it's a bad metric, you know, it's a bad metric for seeing how much people engage with it and what it does. But having said that, again, I think, you know, it is great that with social media, you know, things can spread more quickly. And also people that want to talk to each other can find each other, right? Because I think that's something which I definitely remember as, you know, a teenager is, because I mean, first of all, back then the internet wasn't really the internet. And also I wasn't an internet savvy kid at all, you know, and so it was, I felt, you know, isolated in a lot of, like, I read these books and it was like, well, there's literally no one. I don't know anyone in this village that I could talk to. And there probably were some, but I just didn't know it, you know. And I feel like now this doesn't have to happen to anyone, right? You can really find your community. And I think that is just, that's very exciting.
Yeah.
Well, excellent. On that positive note, I'd like to thank you for this really interesting and passionate interview. It was, it made my day.
It was an eye-opener. That was great.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you both.
Excellent. And well, I'd like to thank as well Unicam for helping me with the camera setups, and obviously like the AGF that gives us money and everything, and everybody at Unimix that helps me to get through with those kind of projects. Thank you, Agatha, as well, for helping me here.
No worries, Ryan.
Excellent. Well, on that delightful note, thank you all for this wonderful Parenthèse Académique, and I'll see you for the next one.